Yeah, we're good. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Mrs. Morris.
Hello, kids. How's everybody doing? Good. Good. Let's move. Did everybody have a nice weekend? Good. So what'd you think of these two videos? Anything jump out at you? Awesome. Okay, let's move on. No.
Well, the stuff about the tall tales and fables reminds me of the old saying, you know, the older I get, the better I was.
Mm-hmm.
And so stories grow and take on a stature and become, you know, epic proportions when the family one maybe really wasn't much of a story to start off with. That happens a lot within family stories. I can relate to that. You stop and think, does my family really have very many stories? And
Right.
you start thinking about it, and you do accumulate. Many of those reminded me of stories I'd forgotten, and actually told one of them today that I'd forgotten about for years.
Yeah, the first question that I posted to our outer circle was actually from the professor, and it was, do you have a story that has reached mythic proportions in your family? Or is there a personal story that is really a tall tale, like it's gotten a little bit bigger than it actually was? And I can't really think of.
Well, I definitely have one.
You definitely have one.
My mother's maiden name is Perez. So my grandfather, Perez, his direct descendants came from Spain. So my mother claims, my aunt and I have tried to document the story and can find nothing to verify any of this. But the story is that when Columbus was trying to get the funding for his ships to go find a new way to India, that's how stupid he was. He didn't really land in India, but we still call everybody Indians. It's really just not cracking up. Anyway, Columbus couldn't get the funding, and so Father Perez, who actually was a real character, he was a confidant of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Father Perez helped Columbus get funding for, I think there were several of his voyages, supposedly, and we are supposedly directly descended of Father Perez, which, well, I don't know what the rules were on priesthood in those days, but you know, kind of, I guess we're all legitimate children of the Catholic Church, but we're also my direct descendant discovered America. You're welcome. So that's pretty much that's reached mythical proportion somewhere when my mother was a kid, because she got it from my grandfather, who you couldn't believe anything he said. But so that's our mythical tale.
You need to get on ancestry.com, right?
Yeah, well, I was named after my Aunt Pat. Let's look all that stuff up. I know
Nothing.
nothing to verify that. Although we are from Spain and we are a Perez, but
Huh.
that's about it.
I think that's interesting.
I just wonder how many, I mean, at least not from us specifically, but how many of our students really can like tell a story that's been passed down to them, just because we always talk about how communication has changed. And I think the oral traditions of speaking, of telling stories, has been kind of lost and has become like kind of a lost pastime. And, you know, because there is so much about like just consumption, you know, if they do hear something, how much they actually hear, how much they actually like take away from it or retain or go, oh, that's really valuable to me, or, you know, I'm going to make that a part of who I am. But I was just kind of like wondering that as I'm listening to her, you know, I mean, how many students really know folk tales or have heard tall tales? You kind of do in nursery rhymes and children's stories and things that you watch, but I don't know, my mind just kind of went to that question, is, has this kind of become lost in contemporary culture?
Maybe kind of categorized in like in age. Think about how awesome it is to revisit some picture books, or whether it's reading with your kids, or pull that awesome book to start the year, like American, different things that, you know, I mean, is there a better lesson in the giving tree or some other things like that, regardless of our religious affiliation. But I think there's some interesting things. I mean, the power of that is pretty cool. And when I think about all the stories from my grandparents, my parents, some of them are really short and little snippets, but how they impacted me or make me think and connect. How we look back to look forward, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And I think asking the question why, I think at the beginning, like why do we tell that story, or why would that be an important story for you to share with kids or to share with family?
Well, I can't really relate very well to math, but.
Tell them
Usually comes up,
okay, count the shifts that Columbus
You know,
had,
it comes up-
divide it by.
It comes up usually like in the beginning of the year or during golf season when I get really tan. They're like, why are you so brown? Oh, I'm Hispanic descent. They're like, you're Mexican? No, not everyone with a Spanish last name is from Mexico. And so then I tell that
Well,
story.
yeah, they're probably like,
And if I
Wilson.
do ask, exactly. So I do ask them, do you have any famous ancestors? And they know, I mean, their hands go up, but they don't know how to tell a story. They just say, we're supposedly related to, Babe Ruth or something. They don't have a story with them. Related to somebody famous, come on, there's gotta be a story. Make something up, Make the story. And you're right, I think even when they do have information or story, do they know how to tell it? And share that.
Jesse, what you were talking about with stories, like stories that we were told as children or whatever, when I taught reading workshop, it was really fascinating to hear how many students didn't remember either being read to or told stories as kids. And I'm like, really? Like, you don't remember hearing like nursery rhymes or children's books or, everybody knows Goodnight Moon. And they're like, and I think it had a huge correlation to their reading because it didn't seem really valued in their home. But I remember as a child, my father making up a story called The Monster and the Teddy Bear. And if you hear me tell it, and if you hear my two brothers tell the same story, it's a little different the way each of us remembers the story. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that. And I wonder, because I remember, I told my kids that story when they were really little. And I wonder if they could tell me back that story that my father told me, I wonder if they could remember it because I haven't told it to them in a really long time.
Do you tell them like, this is why I'm telling you this?
Well, they knew at the time. I would tell them that this is a story that I heard as a child from Poppy. But my dad, I don't remember as a child being read fairy tales. You guys might know. You should know this. But my father used to read me Robert Service poetry growing up, and it's ballads. And so I have I guess as an English teacher, I kind of have an ear for that rhythm and that poetic value. But like he would read me as a small child, I remember being read like the shooting of Dan McGrew and the cremation of Sam McGee, and like these miners stories, and when she was talking about the miner story, I'm like, oh yeah, like I remember hearing stories like this. But I don't remember hearing like princess fairy tales very much as a kid. Do you, Jeremy? Do you remember hearing princess fairy
I
tales?
totally remember the princess one.
That
I'm sure my parents read it. I don't remember, but I'm sure they did.
Do you remember a specific story that your dad would tell you? Because I wonder if he would tell you stories about history that kind of would intrigue you.
I can't think of anything, but I'm sure. I remember Dr. Seuss. That's what I remember.
Yeah.
Yep. I have
Oh,
all those in the little golden books.
yeah.
Hokey
Those
Pokey.
tiny little books.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Uncle Remus stories, which are not real PC. Brer Rabbit, Briar Patch, all that stuff. So.
Yeah. Did you tell those stories to Hayes?
I don't think I have. I remember the Lorax and things like that.
I
It would be
wonder,
interesting, like, I remember reading them a lot. I think even asked my dad and my mom.
because I wonder how many stories that we heard, like Little Black Sambo, have gone away because of, the whole PC.
The racial implication.
I think I have an original copy of that somewhere.
Oh, for
I
sure.
can't even imagine pulling that out and having it on my desk.
Yeah.
I want to just read it.
Well, people would be horrified.
It still
See
exists. There's a
that?
restaurant in Santa Barbara, California. It's called Sam and Rose or something. It's right on the, and they have like copies of it. It's like a breakfast place that like 1 million people go to. I was there. It's been a number of years, but I was shocked. Like,
It's still
it
there.
was right. I don't know if it's still there, but it's right by West Lawn and UCSB. You know,
Oh, that's crazy.
they were proud of it.
And then the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Jess, is that in world literature, when we start talking about cultures and countries, and we talk about like fairy tales from countries like, a lot of the fairy tales are from the Grimm's.
Netherlands. And
Yeah, Netherlands and Europe areas. And, and I'll say, what is a story from America? And they're like, Cinderella. And I'm like, no, that's not, from North America. And they finally will get down to like Johnny Appleseed and with the big blue ox?
Paul Bunyan.
Yeah,
Oh,
like,
Pecos Bill.
Yeah, and they'll
Right.
finally pin it down, but they have a really hard time like naming a story that's solely, a North American story.
So I remember we did a lot of that, like, maybe it was like third, fourth grade, and all of the Pecos Bill, his stories,
Mhm.
and then we would check out books and read all these short stories of American heroes. There was, can't remember the name of the character, but it was something to do with some guy in Arkansas who wrestled bears, and I can't remember his name now.
And David brought some story home last year about the man that burrowed through the mountain to get to build the tunnel. Remember that? Like he had a hammer and he cut through the ground to make a railroad through the tunnel.
Well, that actually happened.
No, I know, but it was the kid's version of the story,
Oh.
and it was just this huge man that did it himself, like the whole tunnel, not like a team. Have you heard that story?
Probably.
I'll have to look at it. But
That's
yeah,
what, I mean, growing up, I read a lot as a kid, but I loved Disney. And like Disney put out cartoons on Pecos Bill and Johnny Appleseed and always put it to music. And like, that's what resonates to me when I think of like tall tales, folk tales. Like I go back to,
Well, I know what you're
Disney
talking about on that.
cartoons.
It's a black guy that,
I don't
or
remember.
maybe that was on the Erie Canal. I remember there was a big man and he did some tunneling. I can't remember his name. It's like Big John or something like that. But there was a song about
That was
Big
it.
John.
It's Big John, like
Big
tunneling
Bad
through.
John, and that
something
he was a
like that.
miner. That was an old,
No,
like
he
in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of story ballads like Johnny Cash and Jimmy Dean and some others would do these ballads that told a story.
well, this was a tall tale about one man burrowing through a mountain. He wasn't a miner. He was building a railroad through a mountain.
It's funny though, I have a lot of books from when I was a kid, and then from when my dad was a kid that I read to Cooper, and it's just funny how stories have changed and how a lot of the new stuff is really.
John Henry?
John Henry. That's what I was
can't
thinking.
describe it. There's always like a moral.
John Henry
lesson
was a
told.
steel driving man or something like
Oh,
that.
yeah.
John Henry, do you remember that story?
African American folk hero and tall tale.
Right, was it for a railroad?
Steel driving man. A man tasked with
John Henry,
hammering a
steel
steel
driving.
drill into rock to make holes for explosives, blast the rock, and constructing a railroad tunnel.
Woo!
Everything's
job.
repackaged.
So see, we don't need to be, we can just Google. all
Yeah,
this.
we'll
Yeah.
Google everything. It's all right.
Everything's repackaged, like what they still have the Grimm TV show.
Yeah.
I mean, look at all the, PC's Hercules, everything's like coming out again, but it's like.
They monitor,
It's
well,
pretty-
yeah,
Yeah,
they
oh
change
yeah,
it.
and then people are connecting, so it's pretty fascinating, the stories they're
Okay, the other question, consider your physical, emotional, social, and intellectual connections to the stories you tell. What genre of stories are you most familiar with telling, and what genre do you want to learn more about? I think my genre is probably stories about my family. Seems like I'm constantly bringing in stories of my own kids or things that they do that I try to make applicable to what's happening in class. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes.
Well, they like hearing about when we were, what we do as a parent or what we did as a kid their age. I have, I never talked much about my children when they were little, but having had teenagers, I love hearing stories about how I dealt with, what's the worst thing you ever did to your kids, but punishment, and I want to know all that kind of stuff. And I've got plenty of stories about my middle daughter that, because they can you tell us another story about Sansi? That's my middle daughter. So, of course, I always tell her, she's just like, I'm sure the story's good, but it's worse. I go, no, I can tell the truth already, man. But, yeah, they really like it. So that's the family thing, parenting, when you're growing up. They like to relate to, they can relate to you, like, oh, that's kind of human. It does help, especially when you're trying to sell a product that they're not particularly in love with sometimes.
Would that be math?
I know it would be for you. I shared this room last year.
I
I say in front of the kids.
I just had a teacher that told me I'd never be good at it. That's kind of hard.
Is that a
Really?
fixed or growth mindset?
Right.
Is that a fixed mindset?
You'll never become a writer. Yeah.
Somebody said that to you?
Oh, we were just saying, never mind.
Yeah, for us to say that to our
Yeah, like
students.
Marcy.
No, she was, old. I mean, it was in the 70s. Yeah. I kind of want to skip the other questions and I want to get to the questions that I wrote for our discussion. Is that okay? Okay, so the first one is, what kind of stories do you share that relate to your culture? Like, can you give an example of stories that you share that relate to your culture that are appropriate for this discussion? Because I will talk about, I can't even remember what unit it is, but I'm assuming it's for World Lit, and we'll talk about where are you from, and people will be like, well, I'm half Italian, and I'm like, really? Like your dad is from Italy? Or we'll have those discussions, and I'll tell them, I'm completely a mutt. I thought that I was a lot of Irish because my maiden name is Quinn, but then when I found out my grandmother was from France and my grandfather was, like, it's really far back to find the Irish blood in my genealogy. And so I think it's kind of interesting to have it, like, especially, God love them, those little freshmen who are like, I'm totally German. And I'm like, really? Because you're not, like, it's kind of funny to hear that. So I think really kind of establishing that, I mean, if you really want to talk about your culture, like the storyteller was like, well, I live in this part of the US and this is what I relate to and these are the stories that I tell. And I think you have to kind of differentiate that for your students before you can really talk about it.
Well, you have to know too. I mean,
Right.
I can sit there and say, to be honest, I've never really looked into my genealogy. I mean, I know that there's some English in there, there's some Cherokee Indian, but I couldn't tell you like what side from. But when I think about culture, it goes beyond race, ethnicity. It's, I don't know, where we were brought up,
Sure.
being part of the culture of Colorado or the culture of our hobbies, our passions, or sports, music, whatever it might have been. So, yeah.
I think that's a good point to bring into the kids, because almost everybody's multicultural anymore. There's nobody who lives in a little village off somewhere, and the village is by itself, and you're that particular ethnic group. Now that does happen in other places in the world, but that's not here. And so then you understand they're part of many cultures, and that can be embraced. You can claim Irish and German. You can go to German festivals and Irish festivals, and all those things. You don't have to be Germany to go, to go enjoy a bratwurst.
Maybe we should plan one of our classes in an Oktoberfest.
Germans are my people.
We just want to explore this culture, so maybe we can tell stories about it.
I mentioned the same thing last week, but watching that, well, first of all, have anybody watched Justified, the TV show? It's all coal miners in Kentucky, so watching this, listening to her story of the coal miner was like completely so much of that show. I mean, the culture part of it.
Is it real?
I've not seen them.
It's like a crime solving, I don't know how.
It's based on short stories that they write.
But based on like the coal miner, it's not appropriate for school at all, but that reminded me, but more importantly, just when we, again, I brought this up, but we went on the Wind River trip, and that was like, the theme of the entire trip was the push and pull of their culture and how these kids, like, they wanted them to go out and make something of themselves and, get an education and go to college, and yet once they did, there was just this huge pull for them to come back because if they left, like, to go become a doctor. Remember that family? They were like, they'd almost shunned this son who left to go to sea and become a lawyer or a doctor. Because if they don't come back, then they can't carry on their culture, their tradition. And that is like the biggest part of them is these stories and their culture and their traditions and they're all those things. So it's interesting. Yes, I'm like Dutch and Runt and all of the other things that you said. But I also, when you think professionally, I think we have such a neat culture built into who we are as warriors. Like that is a huge thing that I feel like kids should understand about us and be able to talk about too, because that's like their number one thing.
Yeah, because
Passing on
diversity
their
isn't
culture.
just ethnicity.
Right.
And I always hate that. Like, well, Rabbit's not very diverse. It's all teachers are white. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of differences between, you can be of the same, of different ethnic groups and still have the same cultures or mores or whatever. So I think we have a very diverse staff. We just don't happen to have a lot of color, but we certainly have diversity. And so how do you, and I think the kids see that when we do talk and share about who we are.
I just had an epiphany when you said that because I totally remember I think there was one, maybe two who had left and become a teacher and came back to the school to be a teacher there. And I think of how many of us have returned to our high school because we've been pulled back here somehow, like we're pulled back to this culture because it's good, like it's good for us, it's healthy for us, it's where we feel at most at home, and so many people want their children to come to this school because it's so good. And I almost get offended, and I don't know how you guys feel, but I get offended when people are critical of this high school. I'm like, and I remember years ago, and I think we talked about this last year in the public speaking class, but how Andrea and I were at the Vacation Bible School at our church, and we were talking to this woman who homeschools her kids, and it was right after the summer after the shooting, and she's like, well, our teacher's returning, and we're like, yeah, like everybody's going back. Almost everybody, not everybody. And she's like, really? Why? And Andrea and I are like, because we can't imagine teaching anywhere else. Like, and we were really surprised that this mom would ask us. And I've asked her since then, I'm like, how long do you plan to homeschool? And she's like, forever. I'm like, okay, because your children don't behave very well at VBS, but okay, you're doing what you think is right. But I get really offended when people are critical of this culture. Anybody else?
Well, I mean, I grew up with this school my entire life. I mean, you kind of did too, Jeremy. And I never thought, and I get offended too, especially when I have friends who are like, how can you go teach at the high school you went to? Like, doesn't that suck? Like, I hated high school. Like, I don't know. I mean, I never thought I was gonna be a teacher until I was, 22 years old. But, yeah, it's something you take pride in, whether it's this or something else, but it does become a part of you, a fabric of what you grew up with and what you're kind of taught. And I always when I tell my students about myself, that's one of the first things I say is, I am a graduate here, but I grew up with this school. I roller skated through the hallways with my sister while my dad was doing work. I play in the wrestling rooms and bounce off the walls, and little water girl for the football team, and went to every athletic event you could possibly think of. And so it's a community. It doesn't define who I am, but it is a piece of me,
Well, I think, there's the perspective of what do we tell our kids about us, but then when I think about, I don't know how many people I tell the story of our relationship with the tribe. Like how many times I talk about the assemblies we have or why it's such a neat thing. And, especially being a coach, you learn all about you can't put the warrior head on the floor, you can't step on it, you can't put anything, it's just, and more importantly, how cool, I've never heard a kid disrespect that in any way. It's not anything that it's even considered something they would joke about or be silly about, or, it's just it's a cool thing. It really is. So
sacred.
it goes both ways, right?
I think our lane crew and then this connection to the way we introduce kids to the culture of Arapaho, they feel like they're warriors right away. I think it's maybe a little more difficult for somebody who struggled, say, at another school. They come here, of course, they always bring their problems with them when they transfer schools, but we don't usually get a lot of that kind of transfer, so.
Yeah, that's energizing. We go to the Moon River, and I did years ago. I don't know if it was those cities or whatever year it was, but it was powerful. And I think, it's been fun to see Cleveland's class develop about that stuff and get more into and other things. And that's something that we have that a lot of other schools don't. That I think could really be more. And I think it's grown. That's what's been amazing. Or the stuff that we experienced, post shooting with them coming down and having the renewal ceremony on the portable and different things like that. I think that was pretty powerful. And that's to me, there's something powerful about why, and to see other people that are about that and their family and the story of their beliefs. I've got our family has half of my uncle's, and he just turned 85 the other day, but he gave everybody when they invited people to his 50th wedding anniversary, but he handed everybody out the family book. And this guy, I've been to Independence, Missouri, and went to this, Mormon genealogy. Every place he goes, he stops by some genealogical place you can research. He's been doing it for years. It has this just phenomenal history to the point, back to one of my relatives supposedly killed himself by shoving a hot musket down his throat or something. I don't know, some weird stuff. I know, crazy stuff. And then, but my uncle has read the past couple of family gatherings. He's read some of his memoirs, and he's through age 10, I guess. He's rewriting stuff about his great grandfather and other relatives that he either read about or learned. But and then we have other side of the family that's there's almost nothing. Right? It's all shared. So it's kind of this creative. But he's the only one when he passes on in a few years or whatever. I'm sure it'll be no one else is really taking that flag. But it's kind of interesting. I got this book that I can look up anything I want about the Trotter history right now. I can pull it out which is cool, but I don't do anything with it. It's I don't take it easy.
So I wonder how we encourage our students to access that information from their elders.
Well, that's what I tell, in U.S. history especially, that's what I tell my kids. I'm if you're fortunate enough to have your grandparents, I said, ask them about their lives.
Yeah.
Because they will tell you things that when they're gone, you'll never forget.
Yeah.
And you will learn things. Talk about a primary source they lived through. And a lot, I'm sure a majority of the kids are yeah, whatever, I'm not going to ask. but the ones that do, they'll come back to you a couple weeks after you say, and they'll be like, oh, I asked my grandpa about this, and he told me this story, and they're so excited about it. And when they can connect it to something we talked about in class, well, like I tell them, that's the stuff about my grandparents. They're gone now, but I will never forget. And the older I got, the more I would just go over there and just ask and listen, and I loved it. Like, I'll never forget that about my grandparents.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always encourage them, like, ask questions, because it is the coolest stuff you'll have. And they'll tell you things, like my grandfather fought in World War II, and he got injured, and I never really asked him any questions about it, but he wrote my dad and I a letter about his experiences. And
Wow.
so it's pretty cool, and like when we're studying World War II, I'll tell them, I'll read them parts of the story, and they're just, they love it. I'm like, that, you have access to that, so, but it's cool.
Well, and my grandmother turned 100 this year, and she's still alive, still doing well. But my sister and I, the last 15 years, we've been filming her, and it's like a little fireside chat. She sits in her rocker, and we do the same thing. We ask her questions, and
Awesome.
she's been filming it, and I mean, everything from growing up through almost every war, the Great Depression, like just hearing these stories. And you said that you never forget it, and it's cool because like I know my dad better for it. I know my uncle better for it. I get to hear just how her life was different and what she appreciated. And I wish that, I don't know, those are the kind of the things that I think connect people. Those, I don't know, that shared humanity that comes across, it's just pure heart and pure, it's real, it's truth. Like you said, it's like the primary source. It's more true than anything else that you can find. But I wish we had a culture, like we sit here and we talk and we listen to each other. But again, I go back to how much would a young kid today, not saying they don't, but would they sit and listen to their grandparents talk for like 3 hours, and actually like take it in and process it and reflect on it and go, like, what did this bring me? What, I mean, this is a gift right here.
Oh.
And, to have maybe like a little realization behind it. Like, I wish more people would do that and just take the time and just the moment,
When you're right, it helps you understand your family better. Like, I saw my grandfather as kind of cranky and racist and not to justify, his racism, but you understand where they're coming from better. And yeah, it was, and I wish I had asked more questions. Like I really, really do. And it was funny, we had a Veterans Day, and I don't know if you've ever come to see the veterans speak, but if you have an opportunity, they're wonderful. And Artie Guerrero, he fought in Vietnam and he was injured. He comes and talks, and he is just, the kids are just hanging on every word he says. But after I watched that one day, I was inspired. I was like, I've never told my grandfather thanks for what he did. So I went home that night and called him up, and I was like, I've never told you this in the 30 some odd years, but thank you for your service. And he was just, you could tell my grandfather was never a real like outright emotion person, but you can just tell he was pleased that I said that to him. And a month later he passed away, and I was like, wow, that was perfect. But the stories, that's what hooks people. That's why it's sad that element seems to be disappearing, because that's what, like in history, kids are always like, I hate history, you have to memorize dates and this. I'm like, no, it's a story. Tell it like a story. There's always a good story behind everything.
But it's funny, but the thing with the grandparents, my wife did an inverse of that a few years ago. We were honoring her father for his service in World War II, and kind of an anniversary kind of thing. And plus, he was first getting symptoms of Parkinson's, so we knew at some point, we weren't able to communicate with him as well. So she had everybody in the family write him a note. She put it together on a scrapbook. It was cool, pretty tough to read.
Sure.
And I saw my 3 children, what they were able to say, and all had 3 different spins on it. And then they mostly talked about the stories that he shared and his skills. He was a handyman, and too many of those kind of guys left anymore. They just talked about how many times they'd have to problem solve in their, in work or at home or whatever, and they think about something their grandpa taught them and that kind of stuff. So it was very powerful in the family and stuff like that. And so, hopefully we'll continue maybe that kind of, we've also done a note to grandma now, so hopefully that thing will continue. In the summer, my granddaughter got to meet my daughter's best friend from high school that she'd never met her before. And then Sarah and her best friend started sharing all the stories. Hannah's like, how come I never heard all these stories? And she was, at first, we're having dinner, she's checking her text, and before long, that phone was gone, and she was totally immersed in hearing about all these stories about her mom and all the shenanigans that went on when she was a teenager. It's pretty cool to sit back and just watch all that escalate, and Hannah was so much into this, and so, again, that all that stuff, and I think one of the things she talked about was the building of the stories and how they get bigger, and so.
That's the funny thing as you get older about friendships. Like when you lose touch with somebody and your lives go in separate ways, but when you come back together again, that's what you have is that commonality that you can I've got buddies that we could sit around all night and just tell stories. And you're right, that you get a little bit bigger and you kind of know that, and that's what makes them funny. But I think that's the cool connection too, because, the older you get out, buddy that doesn't have kids and lives in Philly, so his life's totally different from mine, but when we get together, we have that common.
Well, and don't you think they start by, do you remember when we?
Oh, yeah. He'll random text me someday and just be like, do you remember this story? And it's like, oh my gosh.
Well, there are triggers for memories, like particularly music is a big trigger, and other things trigger it. Like I heard this stupid song the other day from the 60s. I really texted a friend of mine that I grew up with, and just made me think of him, and so I texted him about, he's coaching football, and I said, hey, I didn't mean to say, how's the, back in Kentucky, and in fact, he's in the mining hills there, Moray, Kentucky. And so how's the season going? And so some song triggered that, because we used to listen to those songs together.
The StoryCorps.org, I know was mentioned last week, but 6:25 to 6:30 every Friday they'll play it. I was just looking up, I haven't looked at their website before, it's always on NPR, and I think you heard the last week. I've been bawling like in the party. There was just one about a military guy that was a voice of Bambi when he was a kid. He was in World War II, he was tapped by Walt Disney, so as a young boy, he was Bambi's voice, but he never told his soul, like beyond that he was immediate family, but it's like a cool little. But this one says National Listening Day for Stories is the day after Thanksgiving, and they encourage all Americans to take an hour to record an interview with a loved one using recording equipment. And then these are, I think, archived in the whatever National Library or whatever. So it's kind of cool. And they do it every week on NPR, but it's just people like telling when they have all kinds of themes and stuff. I mean, they travel the bus around the country and get in and record your story and do cool stuff. But it's kind of, I think it's there, but it's like it's just not in our, I think, immediate wheelhouse and stuff that we think about. But it's kind of cool when you look at, what it is or what it is, or mainstream, we recorded the story. Or, it made me even think, like, what if a senior recorded the story here before they left? It was obviously appropriate, but, something like that, kind of interesting. Or staff that, like you all would have actually been in the seats, become teachers and recorded the story for like the seniors to listen to or something. I don't know, I'm just thinking there's cool stuff.
It sounds like a talent show like this.
This one time, but I don't know, but how moving are they? Like more as I get older, I feel like I move more and more in my own. And I think I still don't want to get into them, but then when I start, I can't stop. Or I have an excuse of like, oh, I can't listen to the story now. But it's like a movie or a book or something to get into it. It's good.
Well, it's just, I think back to that, and you look at the number of like World War II vets that are dying on a daily basis, and it's like I have heard stories that every time I think about them, they give me chills. And when you can share that with a class, that it brings it to life. Yeah, I don't know, it's sad that we're losing so many and there's so many untold stories. And we always look at those guys and we're like, well, don't ask questions, they're the silent generation. But yet I think with my grandfather, as he got older, he would tell my dad more and more about his experience, and I think that was cathartic for him.
Well, that thing that my wife had everybody in the family write, and she put it in like a little scrapbook with a lot of pictures. She gave it Grandpa to ride on the plane, to read while he was on the plane, because he did the Freedom Honor flight. You guys heard of
That's so cool.
that, where they
I wish
take the
I'd
veterans
been
and
to
they take them to
My other grandpa did
KC.
that.
And of course, and then he passed around the plane. All these 90-year-old veterans are crying and stuff. He said it's pretty funny. He was just passing. Hey, look at some of these notes my grandkids. They start crying because of what he meant to everybody in the family. And then, of course, they all got
They can
see it.
relate to
When
that.
he told the story about when he went there, and just, different, depending on what theater they were in the war, it just triggered, all these meetings. A lot of guys that didn't want to talk about it, after that, they talked about it. Because they pointed out on that Freedom Honor flight, you need to share. And once you're gone, no one's going to know your story. And so all these guys that were quiet from that age 21 to 90, they could remember so much detail
Oh,
about
sure.
what they went through in World War II.
I'm sure it was in there, like trapped in their excitement.
Yeah.
Well, I went to an
And
interesting.
maybe they didn't even share with their wives.
Oh, yeah, no. I went to an interesting thing over the summer at the Colorado History Museum. And it was a specific county out on the Eastern Plains, I can't remember, but what they did is he was a dentist in town and he went around and recorded like all of the vets and he asked them to tell a story and record them all and they compiled them in this book. It is unbelievable. The book it's like that thick and it's a small county out east.
Wow.
But the stories they have in the book are awesome. Like some are funny, some are serious, some are just amazing. You're like, you lived through that, but yeah, it was pretty cool.
Well, and when you were mentioning your grandmother's fireside stories, I remember teaching American Lit, and I believe in the Library of Congress, there are a ton of recordings of people's experience in slavery in America. And it's really interesting to hear, because you can hear their voices telling these stories. And then when I did the same thing with World Lit, there are also stories of Holocaust survivors. And so it's really interesting to hear the voices with the, because you can tell you can tell stories, you can read stories about the Holocaust, but when you hear somebody telling their story, it's so different, I think. I think I did that when I taught Frederick Douglass. Like, we read that, which is amazing, but then to hear actual people's voices, it was just remarkable.
And it goes back to what she was talking about when you're telling a story and the ways you can be genuine about telling a story. And I think you're right, just by the nature of it's your story, like that becomes even more powerful.
It was really interesting, like at the end of the second video, when she was talking about like keeping a story journal and like keeping track of things that are significant that could be stories. It's, like the whole time you guys have been talking, I've been thinking about how like we have such a reverence for stories from grandparents and from our parents, but pretty soon the reverence will be for our stories. And it makes me think like, what do I have to say? Like, what am I going to talk about? And maybe there's some sort of importance in us keeping track of our stories too.
Sure.
That's true, because my kids will remind me of stories that I told them that I'd forgotten about. You remember that? I didn't remember that now. I make that up? No, it was real.
Yeah, because like my parents don't tell stories. Like my dad, like my mom doesn't even remember when I was born. Like they have no memories. She thinks I'm like 2 years older than I am, and but it like makes me sad that like we don't have that in our family. Like we just have no concept. And my grandparents all died in their 60s, like very young. So I never knew my grandparents. I knew my one grandma a little bit, but yeah, it's unbelievable. Like to think that like that does shape so much of your culture. And I want my children potentially one day to be able to have that. And so it's important to keep track of that.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier, I don't remember who brought this up about, or maybe it was just in my head, but I was thinking about how I very much remember hearing this story of how my father met my mother and how that all played out and like how they're courting. And I'm not really sure we've ever told our kids our story, like how it all began. So I'm sitting here listening to our conversation and I'm like, what are we going to talk about at dinner tonight? You know, because I want them to hear our story. Like I want them to know Grammy and Poppy's story. I want them to know stories. And so I have 100 things going around and, you know, we can talk about our days and how horrible or how wonderful they were, but we don't really tell stories. And maybe that's a simple change at dinner that we can say, well, I want to tell you a story about, you know, when you were born, or, you know, how I met your father, or different things, which is very strange because my students always know the story of how Ken and I met, you know, so it's very strange that I don't really share that story with my own
It's not as long as
children.
the TV show, How I Met Your Mother. that
It's
took like
not.
8 years to find.
It's not. No, it didn't.
Or the Simpsons episode where Marge and Homer tell their story of how they met, but they do it during a power outage where there's no like TV on, and Bart's sitting there like this is compelling, and he's like trying to do everything to the TV, you know, and just not listening. But this is great, Mom and Dad. Damn it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that we have stories that will be important.
Well, you can do like I do. I can only get that many stories from my side of the family, so I live vicariously through my wife's parents and their stories. So, so my grandkids know my wife's side much better than my side. It's almost like to make mine up.
I'm just going to make up my history.
Okay. Like the Father Press thing. I know it's not true, but it sounds good.
And it's interesting though, like how in older cultures, storytelling like is so very important. I'm just thinking about, I don't know if this is really a good example, but my father-in-law is from New Zealand. And he always has like these crazy stories of growing up in New Zealand and all these things. And like in America, our stories are like about different cultures and like how we got here, but they're not like American cultural stories. We don't tell, like for some reason, those don't have as much relevance as I think other cultures are proud in their heritage.
It's kind of like American. It was a colony as well.
Absolutely, but they're so very proud to be.
They're a little more centralized, I guess, because it's smaller.
Yeah, it's just a different, like to me, I feel like Americans are constantly being like what you said, Mara, like I'm half Italian, I'm half this, like nobody's ever like, nope, I'm an American. But like from New Zealand, like, so my father-in-law was born in New Zealand, but his parents were born in Scotland, but he is not Scottish. He is from New Zealand. And like here, we don't do that. Like everyone in my family was born in America, yet I still like, I'm German. I'm not at all. I'm an American, and very much so, but we don't do that here.
Yeah.
We try and find culture instead of embracing our individual like American culture. Maybe why American lit is so stinking hard to teach.
Maybe that, or that it's 3 days a week. All right. Well, anything else that you guys have? One quick question that I had about your students. What do you notice in regards to the way your students tell stories?
I don't know. I think they're scared to just put something out there, even if it's not about them. It's just, what are others thinking of me? How am I coming across? You know, they don't embrace vulnerability, and a lot of times it's very just kind of monotone, and I'll just say it to say it. There's nothing behind it that so you catch it. But it's a lot of they worry too much about.
Yeah, you'll see them raise their hand and they'll start telling a story, and then they just kind of freeze stories up. Or
Yes.
it lacks detail,
Yeah.
it lacks confidence, and there is usually some butthead in the back. You know, and because maybe that's the one kid in another class that's always got the courage to raise their hand. So
Yeah.
it is difficult, especially in a class where maybe it's, we're a big class or
Yeah, I think that's it.
Well,
the
how they-
variables are so different.
But how they're we talked about this last time, but how they process things, how they listen to each other. So I said earlier, I just wonder how much they actually take in if we are disseminating a story, or trying to give a message through something that we're trying to tell, or what are they truly like paying attention to? And is it just kind of like, okay, my teacher's talking now, like, in one ear out the other, or do they catch little gems here and there, but just kind of what they've been programmed.
Well, I can remember going on retreats when I was in school. I grew up in the South, in Bible Belt, and we were much more open to sharing at Sunday school or on a retreat where you have all weekend, you got a campfire, it's a little dark, and people can open up more. Plus, you're very, very comfortable with that group, because you know everybody in the group. So that's a pretty good environment for that, and I think that a comfort level has to be established, and so you probably can get that better in a junior and senior level class than you would in a freshman class where they don't all know each other.
But to be honest with you, my freshmen are more open than my upperclassmen. They are more open to share, more open to like try new things. My juniors are just more, guarded, and I don't know what it is.
Well, maybe they've been judged too many times, and so they don't.
Well, I
Take
think,
the risk of trying to.
I'm shutting this
They're
down.
far more self-absorbed, I think, is part of it. Like they are only thinking about them, and they don't care to like get to know each other, to share, to like build a bond. Like they only care about what they look like in front of the class, and the freshman group is like, whatever, I don't care, I'm like an idiot, cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna tell the longest story of all time.
well, and I think there's a huge difference between something that's assigned and then something that authentically happens in class. Like I'll talk about something and then like 10,000, they all have stories to tell me that in response to what I said, even if it's the most random thing I said. So I think it's interesting that they're a little more eager to share when it's not a assignment,
See, I think of a different perspective in math because that's not really part of the curriculum, but if it's something relevant and somehow I can tie it in and some other kid wants to share, it's usually the brave ones that raise their hand and share, but a lot of times, it's just different because they're not going to be as comfortable in there, whereas if you're in your class, they're actually supposed to be doing it, they may be a little more courageous. So I guess it really depends on what environment they're in, how big of a group is it, and who they know. And but you're right. I mean, just like in math, boys will blurt answers that they don't even close. They're just 496. They'll just throw out a number. Because girls that actually know that, let's be saying, I can tell when they know. Count out. Ask somebody, and I know it. No, 3 to 35. What? And they don't want to go any higher. Like, no, speak up. You have it right. And those kids won't share as much in that setting.
All right,
We need to turn all of our stories into the early, sure, all of our stories. She thinks of a big goal.